All right, let's get right into it. A video about two-phase locking, one of our approaches to concurrency control. So to start out, now that we've finally reached the place where this distinction is relevant, let's review the locks versus latches. So up until now, we've been concerned with latches, about multiple threads, accessing our in-memory data structures, our index, our buffer pool, and so we've used latches to protect our in-memory data structures to make them thread safe. We've held latches around critical sections, the parts of our code where we only want one thread to access at a time, and we've had latches with modes read and write, where we can have any number of threads hold the read mode of a particular latch, but only one hold the write mode. And when it's come to deadlock, which we've seen can happen when we're using latches, we're down to avoiding it through good coding practice, through coding discipline. And our latches have resided in our protected data structure. So our buffer pool had a mutex in it. Our page objects have latches. Our B+ tree index also going to have a mutex. So this is in contrast to our locks, which are about separate user transactions. We talked about transactions last time. We're going to use locks to protect the database contents, the actual data itself, from simultaneous user transactions. So that's the isolation of our ACID properties. We're going to hold these locks through the entire transaction. So we're going to think about logs in terms of being held over the course of the entire transaction, not for just the minimum code. And they're similar modes, shared and exclusive in the terminology as opposed to read and write. But these are analogies. So shared, we would call S-lock for exclusive. That's an X-lock. And there are other modes as well, which we'll talk a little bit about. We're mainly going to be focused on the shared and exclusive, and they have the same properties as read and write. Where shared allows a transaction to read some data. Any number of transactions can all hold the shared lock on the resource. The exclusive lock allows a transaction to modify a resource. Only one transaction can hold an exclusive lock, and no shared lock. Was exclusive only that transaction access that resource. And when it comes to deadlock, we're going to have more tools at our disposal than just coding well. We're going to talk about in this video how we protect deadlock when it occurs, abort a transaction that's causing it, or have a technique to prevent our deadlock from occurring at all via waits for protocol, and we'll get to that for the end of the video. And finally, our locks for transactions are not going to be kept in the transaction or some part of the database, but we're going to have this centralized lock manager. We have one lock manager for our whole database that keeps track of which transactions get which locks, and it's sort of like a traffic light. Or a system of traffic lights kind of saying which transactions go, which wait, and coordinating all this locking. So, speaking of this locking manager, I want to start out with just an example of how these locks kind of interact with the locking manager. All right, so in this example, we have our transaction 1, our transaction 2, and our lock manager. So our transaction 1, it says, give me an exclusive lock on A, then it's going to read A, write A, and then unlock A, and then T2, X lock on A, it writes A, it unlocks A, then T1, comes back, locks A again, reads A, unlocks A. And so over here in our lock manager, when T1 requests a lock on A, it goes to the lock manager and says, please give me a lock on A. And the lock manager says, all right, no one else has a lock on A, so it's fine to grant this exclusive lock. And so we'll say, all right, we have granted T1 an exclusive lock on A, and then it returns to T1, and T1 is able to acquire the lock and proceed. When it unlocks A, it again goes to the lock manager, and the lock manager says, all right, we released T1 on resource A. Very well, then T2 will go to the lock manager, and it says, all right, T1 unlocks, so there's no transaction that currently has a lock of any kind on A, so it's fine if we grant T2 on A. Go ahead and proceed. We write A. We then T2 releases on A, and then T1 can come over here and again request an exclusive lock on A, and again our lock manager can see, all right, that's fine. We'll grant that. And then when T1 unlocks again, that's also recorded by our lock manager. So this is what I mean by a centralized lock manager, that all requests that any transactions are making for any kind of locks, exclusive locks or otherwise, are going through the lock manager, and it has all the information. It knows what all the locks that are currently held in by transactions in the database system are, and so it knows whether it's okay to grant the lock to a particular transaction. And so this is going to allow the database to use particular protocols for locking to enforce the sort of isolation and other properties that we might want to have, as well as to monitor the state of the locks, because anytime a transaction wants to acquire a lock, the lock manager knows which transactions have already tried to acquire it, which other ones are waiting, which locks those are waiting for, and so on. It has the full picture. And so we're going to use these locks, our exclusive lock or our shared lock, our S lock, as I mentioned earlier. We're going to use these in different concurrency control protocols. And we're going to have basically two categories of protocols. We're going to have pessimistic concurrency control protocols, which say, look, I'm just going to assume that transactions are going to conflict. I'm going to choose a protocol that will prevent these conflicts from occurring. So it's committing to doing extra work or putting additional constraints on the scheduling of transactions in the database system in order to make sure that there just can't be conflicts. And so this is pessimistic as opposed to optimistic, which says, so pessimistic is say conflicts are going to occur, so we'll just prevent them. Kind of pessimistically saying conflicts it's inevitable, so we just need to prevent them. Optimistic says, you know what, let's look on the bright side and assume conflicts are rare, so we're not going to do extra work ahead of time to prevent them. We're just going to when a transaction commits, we're then going to check, were there conflicts, and if at that time we find that there were conflicts, we'll resolve the conflicts there. And so if conflicts are really common, this optimistic approach is not going to be a good one, because we're going to have to be doing all sorts of resolution when transactions go to commit. But if conflicts are rare, then the pessimistic is going to be maybe too cautious and too conservative in the sorts of schedules it will allow, and so we'll miss out on some potential parallelism. So today we are going to be talking about two-phase locking, which is usually abbreviated 2PL. This is a pessimistic currency control protocol, and the next video will be about some optimistic concurrency control. So hopefully our pessimistic protocol won't be too much of a downer, but this is our focus for today. So what is two-phase locking? So our transactions here, as I have written them, actually have a problem. That just this locking that we were doing was not sufficient to avoid the kind of concurrency anomalies, to avoid violating our isolation principle property, which is that there's a conflict between this read and this write, in that transaction 1, it changes the value of A, and then when it later reads A is different. That transaction 1 is not isolated from transaction 2, because transaction 2 is able to write A in the middle of what transaction 1 is doing. And so what we want to do in two-phase locking is say transactions have to obey two phases. They have to have a growing phase and a shrinking phase. And what this means is during the growing phase, we can only acquire locks, and during the shrinking phase, we can only release locks. And so what this means is that T1 here would not unlock A until it is completely done with A, because it can, once it starts releasing locks, we're in the shrinking phase and we can't acquire locks anymore. And so we would change to under this two-phase locking, we would not unlock and reacquire. And so we would not have these requests, which means now that we have made T1 consistent with our two-phase locking, what happens is that it's still granted the lock on A, but then transaction 2, it tries to acquire the lock on A, and it is denied by our locking manager. It says, nope, someone else already has the lock on A, you'll have to wait. And so our transaction 2 has to wait in order to do its write and unlock. And so it's waiting, it's waiting, it's waiting. Eventually T1 does its read and it unlocks, at which point the lock manager says, A is now free, I can grant T2 its lock on A, and then at this point T2 can do its write on A and then enter its shrinking phase and unlock. And so in this example, two-phase locking has effectively serialized or made the schedule serializable because T2 is forced to wait for T1 to be done with this resource A before it can acquire it. So what this looks like in say graph form is that if we have number of locks on our y-axis and time here on our x-axis, what we'll see is something like this, where here is our growing phase, and here is the shrinking phase, where our transaction can only acquire locks during the first part of its existence, and then once it starts releasing, the number of locks it holds can only go down. It's not allowed to acquire anymore. And so if it did something like this, that would be a violation of our two-phase locking. It's simply not allowed to acquire additional locks once it starts releasing. All right, to show how two-phase locking can give us serializable schedules, I want to go through some examples. So here we have transaction 1. It's doing the same sort of transaction we saw in the examples from last video, where we want to just transfer 100 from A to B, like transferring money from my account to T-shirts R Us. And transaction 2 just wants to print the sum of the two accounts. And so if A and B start as 1,000, and we're not using two-phase locking, we're just unlocking our resource as soon as we're done with it. What we see is that T1 can begin, acquire an exclusive lock on A. T2 tries to get a shared lock on A because it just wants to read it, but it has to wait while T1 does its update to A and unlock. So then T2 can proceed. It reads A, unlocks it, gets its shared lock on B. It does this before T1 gets its exclusive lock on B. So then T1 is waiting until T2 has read these and printed them out. But and then once it unlocks B, T1 can continue. But what has happened here is that this made A be 900. And so the A that T2 was able to read was 900, but the B that it read was 1,000. So what gets printed out is 1,900, which is inconsistent. There's 1,900, it either needs to be 2,000, it needs to be 2,000 because we're just transferring 100 from one to the other. So whether T1 happens before or after T2, it would be the case that the sum of the accounts stays the same, stays 2,000. So because we're allowing T1 to unlock before it then acquires another lock, so not following these two phases, we can get a schedule that's not serializable. So let's again transform our schedule into something that's consistent with our two-phase locking. So let's say, all right, you can't unlock A until after you've acquired all the locks that you need. So after we're done writing A, we'll get an exclusive lock on B, and then unlock A. And so now what will happen is T2 is still going to have to wait until A is unlocked, then it's able to read. And then when it gets to the shared lock, our T1 won't have to wait for T2 on B. So as soon as it's able to lock B, it can do its update to B, and then unlock B. So this is following our two-phase locking, where all of our unlocks appear after all of our acquiring of locks. And so now our T2 has to wait until T1 unlocks B, where then it is finally able to read B and print. And so now this print will give us the 2,000 we were expecting, because we read A after it's modified, and we read B after it's modified. So we read 900 and 1,100, and we get out 2,000. And so our two-phase locking will give us these serializable schedules. So that's great. We have a protocol that, as long as our transactions follow this, then they'll be serializable. And what's even better is that our lock manager can enforce this. It knows all the requests for locks as well as unlocks that our transactions have made. So it will be able to tell if a transaction tries to acquire a lock after it has started releasing locks. Our lock manager can say, oh no, this is not two-phase locking, and take action accordingly. Abort the transaction or what have you. Now, in practice, the schedules that we generate for our transactions will follow our two-phase locking in order to make sure that they're serializable. But we do have this central locking manager that can help us enforce this. So one issue with our two-phase locking is that it is vulnerable to what are called cascading aborts. It is vulnerable to having done kind of wasted work. So let me show you what I mean. So if we have a situation where our T1 locks A, it locks B, it's following our two-phase like it should. We're going to read A and write A, and then unlock A. At this point, T2 gets a lock on A. It also updates A, and then commits. Or even before it commits, when our T1 later on something happens and it aborts, it's the case that we also need to abort T2 at this time. And that's because T2 read a value of A that was produced by T1. So even though T1 and T2, they're following our two-phase locking, it's possible for these dirty reads to occur. For T2 to read uncommitted data from T1, which would be fine as long as this update that T1 made to A is actually real, actually gets committed. But if T1 aborts, then T2 is sort of leaking information about T1 and must also be aborted. And so this is what I mean by cascading aborts. One transaction aborts, which causes another to abort, which could cause more transactions to need to abort. So this is, this is a potential issue. This isn't guaranteed to happen. You may have workloads where aborting is rare, or these sort of interactions don't occur, but we might be concerned about these cascading aborts in practice. And so what we can do, our solution is a variant of our two-phase locking called rigorous two-phase locking. And what rigorous two-phase locking says is only release locks at the end of the transaction. So instead of this this graph here, our rigorous two-phase locking, if we have the same axes here, time, locks, we still have the same growing phase, but then our shrinking phase is release everything at the end. And otherwise, once you enter the shrinking phase, you're not acquiring any more locks, but you're not releasing them at all until the end. And so this means that other transactions that want to use those resources, access those resources, they would have to wait until you are completely done, until you are committing, so that any changes you made are now real. They're now committed, and so that other transactions that see those changes won't have to potentially abort in this cascading abort situations. So our two-phase locking, pessimistic current concurrency control, it's going to, by enforcing, you have to have this growing and shrinking phase, it's going to not allow some schedules that would be serializable but would not be consistent with two-phase locking. So we're losing out on some potentially efficient schedules by forcing them to follow this. And this is kind of further, rigorous two-phase locking is further in this direction. We're disallowing even more schedules in order to make sure that this cascading abort situation can't occur. All right, so we observed we have this trade-off between limiting some parallelism but getting kind of more guarantees about our schedule. Our rigorous two-phase locking avoids our dirty reads, but we are not totally out of the woods yet. Because we could have a situation that looks like T1 begin X locks A, and our lock manager over here says, yeah, that's fine. And then our T2 gets a shared lock on B. Again, lock manager says, sounds good to me. And then T2 reads B, and then it wants to do something with A. And, well, T1 has an exclusive lock on A, so our T2 is waiting. And then sometime later, T1 starts running again, and it tries to get an exclusive lock on B. So I guess say this was denied because T1 currently has our exclusive lock, and when T1 tries to get an exclusive lock on B, well, there's already a shared lock held by T2 on B, so the lock manager can't give that out either. And now our two transactions are waiting until the heat death of the universe, because they each hold a lock that the other one needs, and neither of them can make progress without the lock that they're waiting for. And so this is a situation that came up briefly in the concurrency lab, and is one that we've observed in some of the projects where our program grinds to a halt when we're trying to acquire a mutex we already have or something like that. This is the fearsome deadlock. So we have two transactions that are just stuck dead in the water because they're waiting on locks that won't ever get released. So we definitely want to be able to resolve this situation. We don't want our database to just grind to a halt when this deadlock occurs, or we want to make it impossible for this deadlock to occur. So we're going to talk about ways of doing both of these things. So the thing that I want to talk about first is deadlock detection. How can we detect when this situation arises and prevent it from occurring? So what we're going to do is, again, we're going to use a graph, handy tools. We're going to create a waits for graph. So what this will be is that when we'll have an edge between transaction I and transaction J if our transaction I is waiting for a lock held by transaction J. And so we'll put these edges into the graph as our lock manager finds that our transactions are waiting. And so in this example, if we have our T1 and T2 nodes in our graph, when T2 tried to acquire S-lock on A, we'd say, all right, T2 is waiting on T1 for a lock on A. And then when T1 tried to acquire an exclusive lock on B, we say, all right, T1 is waiting on T2 for a lock on B. And like we saw before, our cycle in a graph means something bad is happening. This not all is well. And in this case, a cycle means that there is deadlock. And in this case, it's a cycle just between two nodes, but we could also have a situation where there's a whole kind of chain of transactions all waiting on each other, and that will still show up as a cycle in this graph. If we did a simple example with 3 transactions, T1, T2, and T3, where T1 says, all right, lock A, T2 says lock B, and T3 says lock C, and then T1 tries to lock B, at which point T1 is waiting on T2 for B. We have a third node here. And then T2 tries to lock C, so it's waiting on T3, and then T3 tries to lock A. And so now we have a cycle in our graph indicating that these 3 transactions are in a deadlock. And so typically we'd be constructing this graph, the lock manager would be constructing this graph as the database ran, and we'd have a background thread running that just periodically checks our waits for graph in order to identify any cycles. So let's say we have identified this situation. We do have a deadlock. So we know there's a deadlock, but what do we do about it? Well, we just need to abort, to end one of the transactions involved, because if we get rid of any one of these 3 transactions, our graph no longer has a cycle. And so if we abort one of these, some of the others can make progress, and we'll eventually release locks that others are waiting on, and everything proceeds ahead smoothly. So what this means is we need to like with our LRU replacer, we need to identify some victim transaction to abort in order to allow our system to make progress. And so there are a number of different factors that the database system might consider in terms of choosing which transaction. So maybe you would consider the age of the transaction. You want to abort new transactions to allow those that are already running to proceed. You might care about progress, how many of the queries within a particular transaction have actually been run. You might consider the number of locks some transaction already holds. So you might want to choose one that holds only a few locks, so that one that depends on a lot of locks can keep making progress. Or maybe you say, all right, if I'm just going to get rid of one, it's going to be the one with all these locks, and that should free up a lot of transactions. You might also consider the number of transactions that you'll have to also abort and undo and roll back if you abort a particular one. And finally, we also want to take into account how many times a transaction may have already been aborted due to deadlock. We don't want to get it. We want to avoid a situation where one transaction keeps getting stuck in deadlock, and that's always the one that we're aborting, and so it actually never gets to make progress. It is just in this perpetual deadlock situation, and so we might want to take that into account so that we can allow all transactions to eventually proceed. We'll also need to decide kind of how much of the transaction to undo. So do we undo everything the transaction did, or do we just undo it to some previous point and then kind of restart it from there? So that's our way of detecting deadlock. Deadlock occurs, we detect it, we resolve it by choosing some transaction to abort. But we also are going to want to just perhaps prevent deadlock from occurring in the first place. And so that's what I'll talk about next. So for deadlock prevention, we're not going to allow transactions to acquire locks that could possibly lead to deadlock. And so what this, at a high level, when one transaction tries to get a lock that's already held by some other transaction, we are going to abort one of the two transactions, either one that already holds the lock or the one that's trying to get the lock. And by doing this, we're going to avoid the possibility where two transactions are both trying to make progress but aren't able to because they're waiting on each other. Because as soon as one tries to acquire a lock held by the other, one of the two is going to get aborted and the other one can make progress. So there are two different policies that we could use for our deadlock prevention. So we have T1 and T2, and T1 begin, T2 begin, and T2 locks on A, and T1 locks on A. So in this case, T1 is attempting to get a lock on T2, and our different policies are going to be based on the priority of our transaction. And so the older the transaction, the higher priority it would be. So T1 would be higher priority than T2. And our two different deadlock prevention protocols will be called waits die and wound wait. And waits die says that waits die is also called old waits for young. So under waits die, in this situation, T1 waits. In this situation for our wound wait, which is also called young waits for old, is that wound weight says that when a higher priority transaction tries to acquire a lock held by a lower one, it steals that lock and we abort the lower priority transaction. So wound weight would say T2 aborts. So uh, uh, in this case, we're saying that an old, under waits die, our old transaction is going to wait for the younger transaction when it tries to acquire a lock. Under wound wait, our older transaction is going to wound, is going to abort our younger transaction and take the lock. And so the other situation is when we have this in reverse, when our higher priority transaction is the one that has the lock already, and then our T2 is the one trying to acquire it. And so this is the sort of other direction in our policy. And so it's this second part. So when the higher priority one is the one trying to acquire the lock, it either waits or it wounds, it steals the lock. If it's the lower priority that's trying to acquire a lock, it dies. So T2 says, can I lock A? No, I can't. It's held by a higher priority, so I should just abort in order to avoid deadlock. Wound wait says, young waits for old, and so T2 would wait. And so under either of these two schemes, we're going to be able to prevent our deadlock because we're never going to have two transactions waiting for each other. That our older transaction will wait under waits die, but then so T1 is waiting. But then if later on T2 were to ever try and get something held by T1, T2 would die, T2 would abort itself, and then T1 would be able to proceed with its lock on A. Under our wound wait, our higher priority transactions can always get the locks that they want because they'll force lower priority to abort and give them up. All right, so the last topic for this video is about lock granularity. So up until now, there's sort of been this assumption that there's sort of a one-to-one mapping between locks and resources. That if we want to update some tuple, we need to acquire the lock on that tuple. But let's imagine an operation, a transaction that needs to update 1 billion tuples. That's a tremendous amount of overhead to go through and acquire the lock on each of 1 billion tuples. And so we're actually going to have a hierarchy of locks where we have the table, and then within the table we have perhaps pages, and then within the pages we have individual tuples. And so we could acquire a lock on a tuple. We could acquire a lock on a page and thus implicitly lock all the tuples in that page. We could acquire a lock on an entire table and implicitly lock all of the database objects contained within that table. And so this is going to really reduce overhead for these situations where we avoid having to go through every tuple and every page and acquire the lock on each of them. Now, there is a potential problem here if we allow a transaction to acquire a lock on a whole table, and that is, imagine a situation where T1, happily going about its business, modifying an individual tuple, and then T2 comes along and is like, I'm going to modify 1 billion tuples. I'm going to change everything in this table. And so it gets the lock on the whole table. But what it doesn't know is that T1 is down here modifying this tuple, and so T2 can't actually get the lock on all the tuples and change all of them, because that would conflict with T1. So what we'll do is have something called intention locks, which are basically signposts that a transaction will leave that says, all right, somewhere below this object in this hierarchy, I am doing some locking. And so what would actually happen is that T1 would leave a little signpost up here that says it says T1 is doing exclusive locking somewhere below in the hierarchy. And so then when T2 arrives and tries to get the lock on the table, they see, oh, this signpost, this intention lock, is going to prevent it from being able to lock the whole table. And so there are different classes of different types of intention locks depending on exactly what sort of locking is going on underneath. I don't think, we're not going to get into the specifics of what each of these different kinds of intention locks are, but I just wanted to highlight that we do have these different granularities of locks, and we do have a mechanism for transactions kind of communicating that to higher levels in this hierarchy that they're locking somewhere down below. So the notes for today have some more information about the specific types of these intention locks, but you're not responsible for knowing all those different types. All right, so that will do it for our video today. We've turned out to turn out okay, despite being our pessimistic concurrency control. We have our two-phase locking, which is going to give us serializable schedules. We have ways to prevent and or detect deadlock. So things seem pretty good, but they're going to get even better, because next time we're going to talk about optimistic concurrency control and the happy world where we assume that conflicts between transactions are rare. So with that, I look forward to your questions. Ooh. Feels like I'm being sliced up and fed to the void, piece by piece. Oh, the humanity!
This is Olin News 399 with a breaking report that a local instructor has been consumed by the void. We take you now to eyewitnesses who will tell you what they saw.
I think the void is just part of nature. I mean, it was beautiful seeing that man taken by the void. Just part of nature. You know, you really gotta go with the flow.
It was kind of awesome, actually. I'd never seen a void before. Didn't even know it could do that. I mean, it's totally made my day. And I think if I hadn't gotten lost and wandered into this office, I never would have seen anything.
It was terrifying. I hope the void isn't still hungry.
And there you have it, folks. Riveting stuff. Next, are cucumbers secretly evil? An Olin News 399 exclusive right after this.